This past Tuesday and Wednesday marked the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. It was an organized, state-sponsored set of actions that were perpetrated against Jews in Germany. It included the destruction of Jewish businesses, and over 1,000 synagogues were set on fire. There were countless assaults on Jewish bodies, resulting in more than 100 deaths. As an American Jewish community, we are, I think, in the midst of a reckoning about the anti-Semitism that we're witnessing today here in Europe, around the world. And most painfully and powerfully, since the massacre in Pittsburgh in 2018, and then again in Poway just 6 months later, many of us are questioning whether or not America is truly different. Is America truly unique when it comes to the world's oldest hatred? I've written about this repeatedly, and I've spoken about it from this bima, as have other members of our clergy team. Tonight, I want to share a story with you. It's a true story, but it's one that I'm guessing many of you have never heard before. It was new to me. It's one that I came across as I've been reading Dara Horn's new, provocatively titled book, People Love Dead Jews. And there's a chapter in her book about a righteous Gentile whose name we all should know, Varian Fry. He was one of the very few American-born righteous Gentiles who, at great personal risk, saved the lives of Jews during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. Varian Fry's story is remarkable. In 1940, at the age of 32, Fry volunteered to go to Marseille on behalf of the Emergency Rescue Committee, which had been formed for the purpose of distributing emergency American visas to endangered European artists and intellectuals, most all of whom, of course, were Jewish. And over a period of 13 months, Fry helped save the lives of more than 2,000 people, among them such luminaries as Hannah Arendt, Marcel Duchamp, Marc Chagall, Max Ernst, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and André Breton. Fry died in 1967 and was honored by Yad Vashem posthumously in 1997. Now, I recommend reading Dara Horn's book. It's powerful, and it's painful, and it's important, and unfortunately, it's terribly relevant. Fry's story is fascinating, and it's almost worth getting the entire book just to read this one chapter about his life and about his story. But what I want to share with you tonight are two insights about Varian Fry that Dara Horn makes that I think are important. And since it's Shabbat, and I'm a rabbi after all, at the end I'll share a nechemta, a few words of comfort and hope, because it is a heavy topic, but it is connected to our Jewish calendar because of Kristallnacht. In her book, Horn describes a conversation that she had with Varian Fry's son, Jim. And she asked him what he thought motivated his father to take on this rescue mission, to leave his wife behind in America for more than a year at personal risk at times, because there is a moment when the United States actually pulls his credentials and he's really has to decide if he's going to stay in Europe or if he's going to come home. But why did he do that? To try to save these people. His son Jim admitted that some of it might have been motivated by Varian Fry's desire to save some of his cultural heroes. As Jim puts it, I'm sure some of it was to be important and to hang out with famous people. There's an amazing aspect of the story where he saves Marc Chagall's life. And again, I urge you to read it just to hear about how that happens. And maybe that's part of what inspired Varian Fry. He was a fan of the people whose lives he was trying to save. But there was something much deeper as well. We learn in the book that Varian Fry struggled with mental illness. And his son tells Horn this. He says, maybe you need to be a little unhinged to do something like what my father did. Now, what Varian's son suggests is actually truly horrifying, and it helps us understand a deeply troubling statistic about the Holocaust. Since the end of World War II, approximately 30,000 righteous Gentiles have been identified, a little less than that. And Horn says that even if we were off by a factor of 10 or even by a factor of 100, if you look at that number as a percentage of the population of Europe before the war, it's a staggeringly insignificant number of people who were willing to risk their lives. There were more than 500 million people living in Europe at the dawn of the war. And so this makes up something like 0.005% of the population. It's a rounding error. So what does it tell us? Almost nobody was willing to do what Varian Fry did. And it makes us ask the question, in the face of pure evil, why didn't more people come to our aid? And one conclusion that Horn suggests is that there is a madness to resisting evil. A person would practically need to be unhinged, as she puts it, to do what Varian Fry did. She also suggests that there are so many people who are unwilling to do such a thing for others at all the more so for Jews, because of the endemic anti-Semitism that is so much a part of our world. What's horrifying about all of this is that it suggests to us that if we as Jews believe that our fellow citizens will come to our aid if and when times truly get tough for us, we're the ones who are unhinged and deranged. More likely, it is that some will indeed come to our aid, but not so many as to be able to avert disaster. It will be a drop in the bucket. This is a depressing thought, and perhaps Horn is mistaken. Perhaps collectively we have learned the lessons of history, and perhaps the world has actually really changed. And perhaps as well, America is sui generis. America is a diaspora community unlike any other we've experienced. What happened there in Europe then could never, ever happen on a scale like that here. On the other hand, perhaps Dara Horn is right, and our future in America and in other diaspora communities depends on a small percentage of unhinged saviors who will risk their lives and the lives of their own families on our behalf. And that's frightening. The second insight from the Varian Fry story is about culture and what we choose to esteem and what we deem worthy of being rescued. What brought Varian Fry to Marseille was not simply a desire to rescue innocents who had been targeted by the Nazis and their collaborators, but a desire to rescue artists and intellectuals whose fame and renown made them particularly worthy of saving. We're talking about the likes of Marc Chagall. Horn points out, though, that there was no similar effort made by any governments or groups of well-meaning Gentiles designed to rescue Jewish religious culture. It's one thing to risk your life to save Western culture, as embodied by artists like Marcel Duchamp and Marc Chagall. But who was going, as Horn puts it, who was going to risk his life to save the culture of Hasidism with its devotion to ordinary, everyday holiness, or Misnagdism, the opposing religious movement within traditional Eastern European Judaism, whose energy in the years before the war was channeled into the rigorous study of Musar, or Jewish ethics. Entire academies devoted to the Musar movement were destroyed. Their books were burned, and their teachers and leaders and scholars were murdered. All the things that everyone feared would happen to the vaunted culture of Europe, but no rescue committee was ever convened on their behalf. Now, thankfully, much of that culture was ultimately preserved. And there are today arguably more Jews accessing Musar and Hasidic writings than ever before. We've had Musar classes here at the temple. We bring Hasidut into a lot of our sermons and into a lot of our classes as well. But Horn's point is an important one. Many people in this world esteem the contributions that individual Jews have made to Western culture, and we say the names of those artists and comedians and intellectuals of whom we are so proud because they've contributed so much to American culture, to European culture, to world civilization. But if we think for one moment that the world cares a whit about preserving Jewish culture, our tradition of learning, our liturgy, our art, our poetry, our music, we are mistaken. The world will not convene an emergency rescue committee for Judaism. So this has been heavy and depressing, but I promised words of hope and comfort as well, so here goes. First, while Horn is probably right that if and perhaps when push comes to shove, we'd be foolish to imagine that a vast army of righteous Gentiles would save us, it will likely once again be a small group of the unhinged who will risk life and limb on our behalf. But there is a significant X factor that exists today, and it's called Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. With diplomats, highly competent intelligence services, and a powerful army, Israel changes the equation. Our task, as I spoke about on Yom Kippur, is to redouble our efforts to remain connected with Israel, especially during this moment of frayed relationships, a time in which many Jews, especially younger Jews, feel less attached to Israel than previous generations. But by recommitting and re-engaging with Israel in a way that is eyes wide open, confronting all of the wonderful aspects and the challenging aspects as well, if we're able to do that, we can help to ensure that the bond between Israel and the diaspora will remain strong going forward. Through our efforts, in part, we can preserve that sense of what's called in Hebrew amiyut, peoplehood. It comes from the word am, like Am Yisrael Chai. Amiyut, peoplehood. We can preserve that, and it can help us in so many ways, not the least of which being the preservation of Jewish culture and our very existence. The second thing that gives me hope is that notwithstanding what we witnessed in Pittsburgh and Poway, notwithstanding the frightening and meaningful uptick in anti-Semitic incidents in America in recent years from the left and from the right and from the middle too, I still believe that America is different and that we can help to ensure that it continues to be so by actively engaging with the non-Jewish world, by continuing the work of building bridges and building relationships. I really believe that we do make it more likely that if, and God forbid, when the time ever comes, America would end up being more like Denmark than like France. And one more word of hope that's taken from this week's Torah portion. Jacob models in Parashat Vayetze how we might navigate this challenging time. He's leaving home, fleeing a dangerous situation. He's had a terrible falling out with his brother. And night falls and Jacob goes to sleep. He has his famous dream of the ladder to heaven with angels going up and down it. And then God makes a promise to Jacob. In our Torah portion, God says, "Remember, I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land." Now, in some ways, one could argue that God has not been faithful to this promise for Jacob's descendants. We have again and again very much not been protected. We've been as vulnerable as a people could be. Whether we are remembering Kristallnacht or the many tragedies of Tisha B'Av or Yom HaShoah, we are reminded of countless indignities, assaults, and acts of violence perpetuated against our people. How can we argue that God has been with us, protecting us wherever we go? But I want to suggest a different reading of that verse from this week's Torah portion. It doesn't mean, and it shouldn't be read to mean, that God will be there to protect us at every moment in the sense that nothing bad will ever happen to us. That's not what it means. It does mean that wherever we go, whatever does happen, God will be there with us. It's the faith that we are not alone because of a relationship we have with God and because of a relationship we have with our people. Collectively, we will endure, and we have. And that is true, and that is a fact. Yes, individual Jews have been oppressed and persecuted in ways that are unbearable to remember in some ways. But we as a people are so resilient that here we are, not just surviving, but in many, many ways thriving. After centuries of wandering, we have returned to our land. We have returned to sovereignty. And if we read that verse this way, then I think the promise is true. God has remained with us, and God has allowed us to come back to our land. And I find strength and hope and comfort in that reading. Our history includes, to be sure, many, many painful reminders, like the one we commemorated this week as we remembered Kristallnacht, of how vulnerable it is to be a Jew. It warns us not to count too heavily on the kindness of strangers willing to risk their lives on our behalf. But our story is also a story of extraordinary resilience, of grit, of a will to survive that is unsurpassed in the history of human civilization. It's a story also of self-preservation, of the preservation of our Jewish bodies, but also of our rich and glorious Jewish culture, which continues to be studied, and it continues to bring us inspiration, and we continue to add to it day by day. It's a story also of what one Zionist leader calls auto-emancipation, a story of a people who have the audacity to return to sovereignty in our historic homeland despite the risks and the price of that return to power. There is much to be concerned about, but there is so much to be hopeful for as well. Shabbat Shalom.